Hello everybody, welcome to another live Facebook video. We like to call this Facebook Friday here at the Daily Daryl. And today, like the description says, we're asking, who do you know that has questions about traumatic brain injury? Traumatic brain injury is a focus here at Daryl T. Dixon Law. We specialize in these type cases. You're going to hear that basically these come from a number of different things. They come from falls, they come from car accidents, semi-truck wrecks, and sometimes we even have the occasional premises liability case where something falls on top of someone or hits them in the head, or they have other head injuries because of that. So the reason I wanted to get this out to you is we have been asked at Daryl T. Dixon Law to give a seminar on traumatic brain injury in September. So as part of our research, we wanted to go out and see what questions that you might have. Questions about maybe one of your loved ones or someone you know who's experienced a traumatic brain injury. And I'm going to give you a bunch of different cool statistics and symptoms to look out for. Before I go any further though, I need to try and share this video. I want to share it over to my law page if I can. If I can find out that I am on live. And I'd like to ask you if you would please share this video as well. We're going to go about 8 to 10 minutes here and talk about traumatic brain injury. It's looking like at the moment that I cannot share this. I don't know if my computer. So I'm going to just share this over to my Facebook law account page, and we're ready to go. So, okay. I want to start out, traumatic brain injury, as we said, it's more, the main ways this happens, the number one leading cause is falls. People falling, it happens a lot with elderly. It happens in car wrecks, semi-truck wrecks. It happens on the football field, the soccer field. I was a basketball coach for 18 years. I saw a few concussions. One of my players at one time ran into some bleachers just head first. So, and by the way, out there, please submit your questions if you will. And hi, Nick. And I'll be happy to answer any questions during the live segment about traumatic brain injury. But I'm going to give you some stats here that I have in my note. 84% of people who are injured in car accidents will go to the ER with a traumatic brain injury. Of those, 16% are hospitalized, and 3% of those are actually die. So there's exactly, according to the World Health Organization, 138 people per day die around the world with a traumatic brain injury. As I said, the falls are the number one test. And many times in traumatic brain injury cases, the emergency medical team will get there first, and they'll issue something called the Glasgow Coma Scale. And it's a scale of 1 to 15, and they're trying to see what your consciousness rate is, what your response rate is, how is your speech, is it slurred? And so they'll give you a grade on that. A lot of those tend not to be accurate depending upon the time when they're given. And a lot of times at the hospital, the first test that's going to be given is a CAT scan, some x-rays, obviously. Most of the time, there's not an initial MRI. And sometimes MRIs can't pick up a traumatic brain injury within days of the accident, whether it be a fall, a hit on the football field, or what. As a matter of fact, 95% of traumatic brain injuries will have a negative MRI scan, a negative CAT scan, in other words, after the initial accident. You have almost 86 or so million, or actually billion cells in your brain. And inside of those cells are neurons which send electrical charges through something called axons, and they go from neuron to neuron, transmitting information throughout the 4 lobes of the brain. In 2014, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, did away with the term concussion. I know we still use it, especially in sports. It's used a lot of times in hospital medical records, doctors' records. They often talk about concussion and post-concussion syndrome. But the true word now for concussion, as changed by the Center for Disease Control in 2014, is a mild traumatic brain injury. And there's also several different types of traumatic brain injury. There's the mild, the moderate, and the severe. And the severe would be some kind of major blow, something maybe that's stuck through your head or into your head. Most of these brain injuries that we deal with are going to range from mild to moderate. And yeah, Nick, thanks for the question. The most common type of accident or injuries that result in TBIs are falls. Falls by elderly, falls by, that's the number one leading cause. And I guess car accidents, and then on down to football hits and sports. So yeah, there's no such term anymore. According to the Center for Disease Control, as concussion, it's now mild traumatic brain injury. We talked about the cells in the brain, there being 86 billion. There's the blood vessels, there's 400 miles of brain, vessels in the brain, blood vessels in the brain. That's like going from, Los Angeles to San Francisco one time. When you have a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, only 2 to 15% of those will have persistent symptoms. In other words, doctors will always and normally tell patients that, when you have a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion, that it will get better. And 85% of those do get better in the first 6 months, in the first year. Those that don't get better is what we call the miserable minority. Those are the ones that are going to have symptoms, and most likely after a year they're going to be permanent. Most of the time you can look around a room and you cannot tell a person with a traumatic brain injury from another person. It's just not something that's written all over your face. It's not something that they can go in and fix like they can a spine or a leg or an arm. It's there's not surgery options when it comes to traumatic brain injury, because what happens is there's a blow to the head, and the brain, for instance, is like a piece of 3-pound Jell-O in a bowl. So just imagine that. That's the best thing to imagine, the brain inside of your skull. And inside your skull, it's not smooth, the surroundings of your skull, it's more rigid. So when that brain takes a hit, that Jell-O-like surface called the brain, it'll rub and twist and turn up against the rigid skull. And it causes those neurons and axons to sometimes tear, sometimes twist, and sometimes just take a hit in which there are what's called lesions or tiny foci in the brain. And those are objective evidence that can be seen on a T2 scan, a T3 scan. Those are objective evidence of a traumatic brain injury. And the treatments will range as it pertains to severity, meaning mild traumatic brain injury, moderate, and of course severe. Severe, there's going to be bleeding and possibly blood clotting. And that's kind of another subject for another day. We're going to kind of stick with the mild and the moderate for the purposes of this talk. One of the best ways to test for traumatic brain injury is through subjective complaints. This person will talk about having memory loss, confusion, dizziness, unsteadiness in their gait. Those are common symptoms of traumatic brain injury. And again, they're hard to treat. There are medicines that make it better and can treat certain symptoms. And then you'll see the other complaints come from family members, friends, coworkers. My brother just doesn't seem like he's the same person that he was before the brain injury. He's not as friendly. He's combative. He's standoffish. He's a recluse. He doesn't want to talk anymore, doesn't want to socialize. And so those are some of the complaints that you get from family members, co-workers, siblings, spouses. Again, we talked about the brain, 3 pounds, it's 73% water. And like I said, it's jello. If you were to take the top and screw it off of your head, you would see the brain sitting there like a 3-pound piece of jello in a bowl. And then you put the top of the brain back on, and you can imagine when that sucker takes a hit, that jello's flying around and hitting maybe several different times against the rigid inside of the skull. And like I said, those neurons, those axons inside your brain cells, those tear and twist and otherwise are damaged. I think it's important to note that within the brain, there are 4 different lobes that you need to be familiar with if you're looking for traumatic brain injury or you have questions. There's the frontal lobe. That's going to be right up here, just like it says, the front part of the brain. And that's where you're going to process information. You're going to control behavior right there in the frontal lobe. And then you got the temporal lobe. And these are your temples right in here. And this is your life bank, your memory. You're going to be remembering things. Sometimes people lose memory in traumatic brain injuries. If they're in a car accident and they slam up against the side of the car or the steering wheel or whatnot, sometimes they lose short-term memory, long-term memory, and that's because there's been damage to those temporal lobes. The parietal lobe is going to control, and it's going to be like maybe where you'd find the soft spot of a baby's head up to the temporal lobe. And that is the part of the brain that's going to control your movements and your actions. And just so you know, the left side of the brain, I'm pointing to my left side, is going to control my movements on the right side, and the right side is going to control my movements on the left side. And that's your parietal lobe. And then your occipital lobe is where your emotions are. It's where it's another processing center, but you see someone and you recognize, that's my grandmother. And then that's where your emotions come on. And, it makes you happy to see your grandmother. It makes you sad to watch somebody, get hurt or whatever. So that's going to be in the back, and that's the occipital lobe. So 4 lobes to the human brain, very complex, the research is ongoing about the brain. It probably will until the end of time. But we do understand so many more things today about traumatic brain injury. And then, of course, there's lawsuits in the NFL against encephalopathy. And there's been so many, there's been settlements, there's other lawsuits. You see these NFL players, after taking year after year after year hit to the head, and they're just not the same anymore. And they get into their older ages, and it's just devastating for them. They can't remember things. They die early. I think Junior Seau, he committed suicide because he had damage to many different parts of his brain from those repeated hits. And anybody that saw him play, knows that he was fearless and had lots of contact. So, I guess the next, the thing about these NFL players, and that is another topic for another day, and we'll certainly get into that, especially as it becomes more and more prevalent in the news, and there's going to be more lawsuits and such. But traumatic brain injury is much more difficult on older people than younger people. It's easier to bounce back if you're a high school football player and you got your bell rung. You had a concussion, a mild traumatic brain injury. Once you get into your 40s, and yes, 40 is old in terms of brain injury lifespan. You have a traumatic brain injury of mild or moderate severity. It increases, I think I was reading a New York Post article just yesterday, it increases your likelihood of getting early onset dementia by almost 22%. So there can be permanent long-term effects. There's other studies out there, again, another topic for another day, on the likelihood of increasing your chances for Alzheimer's disease because of traumatic brain injury. So in other words, if age really has that big of an effect, you know, a 52-year-old is not going to recover as fast as a 20-year-old from a brain injury. It's going to be harder. Women brain injuries tend to be, they're easier to be more severe than men. And that's another stat. I think we've went through the stats, we've went through the lobes of the brains. I'm welcoming any more questions. I think I've got a few here. I'm going to check them. And I think one of the questions is, do traumatic brain injury cases, are they an issue at nursing home? And the answer is absolutely. We have one case right now in litigation from a gentleman falling and having a subdural hematoma, which is a severe brain injury after a fall at a nursing home. So if you've listened to everything we've talked about, obviously you know our elderly population are so much more susceptible because their muscles have atrophied a little bit, so they're not as strong. Their balance isn't as good as when they were younger. And so nursing home fall, you know, it's basically the falls, the number one cause of traumatic brain injury that you have to look out for. And I know a lot of nursing homes have strict regulations and policies about fall risks, and there's different ways they identify that. But nursing home, that's probably one of the biggest areas of traumatic brain injury is elderly patients falling. I know a lot of elderly people fall, and break hips, and so there's a lot of orthopedic injuries as well. But yes, traumatic brain injury is absolutely a big risk at nursing homes. Checking to see if we got any more questions. And yeah, there's one that says, if I'm knocked unconscious, am I more likely to have traumatic brain injury? And that kind of brings me something that I was going to wrap up in the term amnesia. If you're knocked unconscious, that you basically start out between a mild and a moderate brain injury. Now, obviously the time that you're unconscious will determine how severe it is. But in other words, if a patient, and we're going to get to this a little bit later, if a patient at a nursing home, if someone in an accident or a fall or a football game, I think what you want to, a lot of these people cannot tell because they don't remember whether they were knocked unconscious. And the medical records, quite frankly, are unreliable because there's not going to be EMS there immediately upon the impact. So someone could have been unconscious, came back, they could have went out again, and you wouldn't know. But the thing that I would like for you to pay attention to is amnesia. And it can be amnesia 24 hours before a fall or an event, or it can be 24, 48 hours after an event. And if you've got people who suffer a traumatic brain injury and they don't remember anything for the next 24, 48, 72 hours, you're starting with a moderate traumatic brain injury. So in the 3 levels, you're already at next to the most severe, and that's amnesia. And it doesn't matter whether that amnesia is after the event or before the event. But thanks for the question. And yes, consciousness is a big part of this. But again, a lot of these people, they're not going to remember, and they're going to do their best to be honest because they want, with their doctors and their treaters, because they want to get the best help that they can. And it helps us, if we're litigating a case or whatever, to know, what do you remember? How long were you out? When did you start remembering? What memory do you have? Do you remember what you were doing before? Do you remember what you're doing after? In most cases, someone who's suffered a traumatic brain injury they're probably not going to remember events from the time of the so-called impact of their head, whether it be a fall, accident, football injury, or whatever. Probably after that, they're not going to remember those first 24, 48 hours if it's a moderate brain injury. And I guess finally I'll close up with talking about the mild traumatic brain injury. And that's one that's going to be diagnosed as mild when there's not a whole lot of objective evidence. There's nothing on the MRIs. There's nothing on the CAT scans, the x-rays. It's just those subjective complaints. I don't feel the same. Something's not right. The complaints from friends and stuff like that. That's mild traumatic brain injuries. And we have other ways of testing for that. We bring in neuropsychologists who do neurocognitive testing. Sometimes this takes 1 or 2 days, and it's a battery of tests. There's EEGs that can test for brain injury. And those are kind of a subject for another day. Today we're just sticking with objective evidence, and we'll definitely come back and talk about neuropsychologists. We'll talk about EEG tests and all that. But I think we got another question. A question from Michael. I have a pedestrian knockdown case where the client, this is another lawyer I think, where the client had a concussion and a loss of consciousness at the scene. She has memory loss and constant headaches. The neuro reports don't seem to say TBI. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, if you've got loss of consciousness and that, I would be very interested to know if she suffered from amnesia, Michael. And if she does, I think, and I'd also be interested to see if there has been CAT scans or MRIs but yeah, I definitely think you're going to want to send her to a neuropsychologist if she hasn't been already. They can, test more of the cognitive functions, and then maybe a neurologist to check the actual, the brain and the MRIs. And I think a neurologist is going to want to do an EEG as well. Okay, I think you're saying the CAT scans. And again, I said earlier, a lot of the MRIs right off the bat, right after an injury, are going to be normal. But that does not mean you don't have a traumatic brain injury. I forget what the stat was. I think I mentioned it earlier. But there's a number, that are not diagnosed immediately. And just so you know, an MRI will show brain injury, brain damage, we like to say. Those foci, which are lesions on the brain, which mean it's hit against the side of the skull and it's been sheared. It's almost a shearing effect on the brain. And the only thing an MRI can't tell you is what is the timing on that injury? When did it happen? Sometimes we can look back 2, 3, 6 years at an MRI, and a neurologist or a neuroradiologist cannot look at it and say, well, this happened on this time scale. And but trauma, when you see those foci, there's other things that can cause them. Hypertension can cause it. Hypercholesterol can cause that. Smoking in limited events, long-term smoking can cause that shearing type injury, those foci or lesions, I think is an easier word to understand, on the brain. But typically, if it's the hypertension, cholesterol, smoking, or whatever, it's going to be a bilateral, which means on both sides of the brain. And a lot of times in trauma victims, you're just going to see damage to a certain side of the brain. So I hope that helps you. And if it doesn't, look me up here after the show, and I'll be happy to help you with that, Michael. Because that you're in that miserable minority. And there's more in that than there are the moderate, severe terms. So it's something that definitely has to be looked in and definitely has to be treated. Seeing no more questions at the moment, so I'm going to wrap up. Again, age is a huge factor. We talked about amnesia. We talked about the stretching, the twisting, the breaking of these axons that connect the neurons in the brain, which fire off those they fire off information from one. And you can lose 10,000 of these in a traumatic event. So and it can damage other ones through that shearing and breaking and tearing and twisting. We talked about Glasgow Coma Scale. We talked about positive imaging, foci, lesions that show up on the MRIs. Michael, I'll go back to you. Did your client have headache, anxiety, fatigue, intolerance, memory loss, short-term and long-term? They had irritability, frustration. Could they not answer questions? These are all symptoms of the traumatic brain injury, mild or moderate. And we talked about neuropsychologist testing, and we'll certainly come back and do something on that later. And that's about it. I had one more thing I wanted to show you. And this is just basically how doctors and neuropsychologists are going to rate these things in terms of traumatic brain injury as being mild, moderate, or severe. And and this goes back to a couple of the questions we had. If there is a loss of consciousness greater than 30 minutes, it's definitely, concussion, mild, traumatic. Less than 30 minutes. It's going to be on the mild side of the traumatic brain injury. If there's post-traumatic amnesia of a day or less, it's going to be mild. If it's more than a day, 24 to 48 hours, you're looking more at a moderate traumatic brain injury. And then 24 hours to 7, you can also, if there's major disorientation and confusion at the initial scene, which a lot of times there is after a heavy event, or if you're picking a football player up off of the field and trying to treat them for a possible concussion that we see more and more these days, that disorientation and concussion can turn and confusion, can turn that concussion into a moderate brain injury if the symptoms last after that. So it's a matter of how many symptoms. It's a matter of different ways of showing these symptoms, and whatever it's labeled, mild, moderate, or traumatic, it's still a serious injury. I know football and basketball, I know some of your sports now, they have a lot of concussion protocols where, athletes cannot be put back into the game without a battery of tests being run. And many times that takes them out of that particular game. And sometimes maybe even the game after. So, hey Mo, how's it going today, big guy? And, I think it's time to wrap up. Didn't want to take a whole lot. It's Facebook Friday here at the Daily Daryl. We're talking about traumatic brain injuries. Any questions you have, shoot them at me. As I told you, I'm preparing to lead a seminar here in the fall, and I wanted to start putting a lot of notes together on these and get it in a fashion where I can teach it and I can put some stuff together, some videos and everything for the audience, and just work on that. So this was my first day, limited notes, almost zero preparation. So I'm just trying to get better at the way I present this because I want to give this audience what they're paying for. So I hope everybody has a fantastic Friday, a Facebook Friday. It's Daily Daryl, and send us your questions. We'd be happy to answer them. Direct messages, text us from our website. You can go on any of the social media platforms. Go to darylonsocial.com and direct message me on any of the social platforms. And we'll put this back up on our Facebook site so you can look at it later. And again, we're fair game for any of your questions. Thanks so much for spending a few minutes of your lunch with us. Daily Daryl, and we're out.